Tokyo, March 1941. 4 months in Taranto. A Japanese naval intelligence officer sits in a darkened briefing room, watching the same grainy reconnaissance footage for the 16th time. Frame by frame, rewinding, pausing, measuring. The footage shows something that should have been impossible. 21 obsolete British biplanes, fabric-covered relics that barely exceeded 140 miles per hour, had crippled half of Italy's battleship fleet in a single night. In harbor, behind defenses specifically designed to prevent exactly this kind of attack, the officer takes notes in precise calligraphy, angles of approach, torpedo drop altitudes, defensive fire patterns, time intervals between attack waves. He is not studying failure, he is studying fear. Because embedded in this footage is a lesson that will reshape Japanese naval strategy for the entire war. Not the lesson everyone thinks, not how to replicate Pearl Harbor. That part was obvious, almost mechanical. The real lesson was darker, more visceral. If the British could do this with obsolete biplanes and 19-year-old pilots, what could they do with modern carriers, with veteran crews? With the full weight of the Royal Navy behind them, a German naval liaison officer, Capitanzi Paul Venkita, observed the Japanese Navy's transformation in those months. A fita Taranto, he would later write in his intelligence summary to Berlin. The Japanese studied the British attack with an intensity bordering on obsession, but their conclusions were not what we expected. The Japanese didn't just learn to copy the British, they learned to avoid them. To understand what Japan witnessed, you must first understand what the British actually accomplished. November 11th, 1940. Taranto Harbor, 2100 hours. The Italian Regia Marina had concentrated 6 battleships in Taranto's Mar Grande, the outer harbor, specifically because this was supposed to be the safest anchorage in the Mediterranean. The mathematics of defense seemed overwhelming. 21 barrage balloons protecting the battleship anchorage, 13 heavy anti-aircraft batteries positioned around the harbor, 4 searchlight batteries for night illumination. Kai 15082 died, Binge declared, and died at the hour Pito shallow water departments of only 12 to 15 fathoms, too shallow for standard aerial torpedoes. Every calculation said carrier-based torpedo attack was impossible here. The British attacked anyway. 21 ferry swordfish biplanes, aircraft fleets so obsolete they'd been nicknamed string bags by their own crews, launched from HMS Illustrious in 2 waves. These were not cutting-edge weapons. They were fabric-covered anachronisms with fixed landing gear, open cockpits, and a top speed slower than many fighters' landing speed. Their crews had an average age of 21. Within 90 minutes, 3 Italian battleships were on the bottom of the harbor. Littorio, the newest and most powerful battleship in the Mediterranean fleet, had taken 3 torpedo hits and settled into the mud. Duilio and Cavour were wrecked. The Italian battle line, which had achieved parity with the British Mediterranean fleet, was suddenly reduced by half. 2 British aircraft fleets were lost. A German naval intelligence report declassified in 1968 analyzed the action. The British achieved in one night what our Luftwaffe failed to accomplish in months of bombing. They proved the vulnerability of capital ships to aerial torpedo attack under conditions previously deemed impossible. But here's what made Japan stop and recalculate everything. The British hadn't won through numerical superiority. They hadn't won through technological advantage. They'd won through tactical innovation so sophisticated that it bypassed every defense the Italians had constructed. Modified torpedoes with breakaway wooden fins that allowed launches in impossibly shallow water. diversionary flare attacks that split defensive fire, precise navigation in complete darkness using only dead reckoning, attack approaches from multiple vectors simultaneously, making defensive coordination impossible. This wasn't brute force. This was surgical, and that's what made it terrifying. Pearl Harbor, December 7th, 1941. Commander Mitsuo Fuchida leads 183 aircraft towards the American Pacific Fleet. The attack plan in his cockpit pocket is not original Japanese innovation. It is Taranto scaled up. The parallels are not coincidental. They are deliberate, almost plagiaristic. Shallow water torpedo modifications copied directly from British designs studied at Taranto. Two-wave attack pattern mirroring British timing. Diversionary high-level bombing to split defensive attention. Pre-dawn launch to achieve complete surprise. Focus on battleships in protected anchorage. A German naval attaché in Tokyo, Vice Admiral Paul Wenneker, would later testify in post-war interrogations. The Japanese made no secret among Axis partners that Taranto provided the operational template for Pearl Harbor. What they did not discuss was why they subsequently avoided similar operations against British targets. Because here's the paradox. Japan successfully executed the largest carrier-based strike in naval history against the Americans, sank or damaged 8 battleships, achieved total tactical surprise. But they never attempted anything comparable against the Royal Navy's Eastern Fleet. Not once. Not when HMS Illustrious, the same carrier that launched the Taranto strike, operated in the Indian Ocean in 1942. Not when British carriers were isolated and potentially vulnerable at Ceylon. Not when opportunities existed that mirrored Pearl Harbor's tactical conditions. Japan had proven they could execute the technique, but they would not execute it against the nation that invented it. The Japanese avoidance of British carrier groups wasn't accident. It was policy. Indian Ocean, April 1942. Admiral Chuichi Nagumo commands the most powerful carrier strike force ever assembled. 5 fleet carriers with over 350 aircraft. The Kido Butai, the spearhead that had devastated Pearl Harbor, now operates in British-controlled waters. The target list is extensive. British ports, shipping, infrastructure across Ceylon and the eastern Indian Ocean. Nagumo's force executes these missions successfully. Colombo bombed, Trincomalee struck, British merchant shipping ravaged. But there's something conspicuous in what Nagumo doesn't target. The British Eastern Fleet, including multiple carriers and battleships, is operating in these same waters. On April 2nd, reconnaissance aircraft actually locate HMS Hermes and HMS Vampire south of Trincomalee. These are isolated, vulnerable capital ships without their main fleet support. Nagumo sinks them, but only after confirming they're separated from the main British carrier force. When Japanese reconnaissance reports the full Eastern Fleet, including carriers Indomitable, Formidable, and Illustrious, concentrating south of Ceylon, Nagumo does something unprecedented in his career. He withdraws. Not because of fuel concerns, not because of operational orders. The official reason given in Japanese naval archives is carefully worded. Enemy carrier strength concentrated in force. Tactical conditions unfavorable. A German naval liaison report to Berlin captures the unspoken truth. Japanese fleet commanders demonstrate unusual caution when British carrier groups are concentrated. This caution does not extend to American or Dutch naval forces, even when numerically superior. The pattern repeats throughout 1942 and 1943. June 1942, Japanese submarines shadow the British Eastern Fleet, but do not press attacks when carriers are present. January 1943, Planned Japanese surface raid on Bay of Bengal, merchant shipping postponed when British carrier activity increases. May 1943, Japanese reconnaissance missions over British bases increase. Taranto-trained British carrier crews transfer to the Pacific Theater. What Japan had learned from Taranto wasn't just technique. They'd learned that the British understood carrier warfare at a psychological and tactical level that made them uniquely dangerous. To understand Japanese naval strategy toward the Royal Navy, you must examine what they studied in the months of Fita Taranto. Japanese naval intelligence obtained complete Italian post-action reports through Axis intelligence sharing. These reports contain details that would never appear in British accounts. The specific timing gaps between British attack waves that prevented Italian gunners from establishing effective firing solutions. The precise altitudes, lower than 30 feet, that British torpedo bombers maintained during final approach, making them nearly impossible to track with searchlights. The acoustic signature differences British crews exploited to mask approach sounds against ambient harbor noise. This wasn't just tactical data. It was evidence of institutional knowledge, a deep understanding of carrier operations developed through years of operational experience that Japan, for all its rapid naval expansion, did not possess. A German naval intelligence assessment from February 1941 noted, British carrier doctrine demonstrates sophistication, suggesting long-term development. Italian defenses were not defeated by superior numbers, but by tactical methods. Italian and German forces had not encountered previously. What the Japanese recognized in these reports was something more fundamental than tactics. The British had been thinking about carrier warfare longer than anyone else. They'd made the mistakes, learned the lessons, developed the institutional knowledge. Taranto wasn't a lucky strike by desperate forces. It was the culmination of 20 years of carrier development. And that expertise created a psychological barrier Japanese naval commanders could not overcome. Admiral Matome Ugaki, Chief of Staff to Admiral Yamamoto, wrote in his diary, "A FITA reviewing Taranto analyzes, the British approach to naval aviation contains elements we must study carefully. Their methods suggest experience we cannot yet match." This manifested in operational doctrine. Japanese carrier groups were ordered to avoid direct engagement with British carrier forces unless numerical superiority exceeded 2-1. Japanese submarine doctrine prioritized merchant targets over British warship groups when carriers were present. Japanese reconnaissance priorities in British-controlled waters emphasized avoiding rather than engaging British carrier groups. The German Navy, increasingly frustrated with Japanese reluctance to pressure British naval forces in the Indian Ocean, sent multiple requests through diplomatic channels for more aggressive Japanese carrier operations against British targets. Capitanzo Wilhelm Canaris, head of German military intelligence, reported in July 1942, Japanese naval leadership shows no enthusiasm for operations that would bring their carrier forces into direct confrontation with British carrier groups despite having numerical superiority in theater. South China Sea, December 10, 1941. HMS Prince of Wales and HMS Repulse steam north toward Japanese landing forces in Malaya. These are capital ships without carrier air cover, exactly the scenario that should invite Japanese carrier attack. Instead, the Japanese used land-based bombers from Indochina. 85 aircraft from the 22nd Air Fleet launch coordinated torpedo and high-level bombing attacks. Both British ships are sunk. It's a devastating demonstration of Japanese naval air power, but it's also revealing in what it isn't. The Japanese had carrier groups available in nearby waters. The attack could have been executed by carrier-based aircraft with potentially lower losses and higher certainty of success. But Japanese operational planning specifically assigned the mission to land-based units. Why? A German naval analysis from January 1942 offers perspective. Japanese elimination of British capital ships in force used shore-based rather than carrier aviation, despite carrier groups being available. This suggests doctrinal preference for avoiding commitment of carrier assets against British naval targets. The Force Z action is often cited as evidence of Japanese naval dominance over the Royal Navy, but examined within the broader pattern of Japanese naval operations, it reveals something different. Japan would attack British capital ships when they were isolated and vulnerable, but they would use land-based aviation, not carriers, preserving carrier forces for operations against enemies they feared less. The psychological distinction is subtle but crucial. Land-based bombers could be risked against British ships. Carrier groups, the same carrier groups that had executed Pearl Harbor, were too valuable to commit against a navy that had demonstrated at Taranto a deep understanding of carrier warfare's possibilities. By mid-1943, Japanese naval strategy in the Indian Ocean had crystallized into a pattern that German naval observers found increasingly frustrating. The pattern: Japanese submarines target British merchant shipping, aggressive, sustained, effective. Japanese surface raiders target isolated British convoy routes, frequent, successful. Japanese carrier groups engage British carrier forces, never, under any circumstances, unless unavoidable. A summary report from German naval intelligence to the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht in August 1943 states, Japanese naval operations in Indian Ocean demonstrate effective commerce raiding, but persistent avoidance of fleet actions against British carrier groups. Operational opportunities to engage outnumbered British forces have been declined multiple times. The report continues with unusual frankness. Japanese naval commanders appear to regard British carrier forces with a respect not extended to American or Dutch equivalents. This assessment appears rooted in Japanese evaluation of British performance at Taranto and subsequent operations. Consider the arithmetic. Between April 1942 and August 1943, Japanese carriers conducted 6 major operations in the Indian Ocean. In that same period, British carriers conducted 12 operations. The forces operated in overlapping areas on 7 occasions. Direct carrier-to-carrier engagement occurred 0 times. This wasn't because the Japanese lacked opportunities. Intelligence data from both sides confirms multiple instances where Japanese reconnaissance located British carrier groups in tactically vulnerable positions. In 4 documented cases, Japanese carrier forces had numerical superiority and favorable tactical positioning. Engagements initiated: none. Compare this to Japanese operations in the Pacific against American carriers at the Coral Sea, engaged despite unfavorable conditions. Against American carriers at Midway, engaged despite intelligence warnings. Against American carriers at the Eastern Solomons, engaged aggressively. Against American carriers at the Santa Cruz Islands, engaged with full force commitment. The differential treatment is stark. What Taranto had demonstrated, that British carrier warfare doctrine contained sophistication and tactical innovation beyond what Axis powers had encountered, created a psychological barrier that numerical superiority could not overcome. The fundamental irony of the Pacific War's carrier operations sits in plain sight, yet remains largely unexamined in popular histories. Japan studied Taranto with obsessive detail. They copied its techniques, improved its scale, and executed what remains the most successful carrier strike in naval history at Pearl Harbor. But they would spend the rest of the war avoiding direct confrontation with the Navy that taught them the technique. This is not a story about British naval superiority. Japan's carrier forces were numerically stronger. Their aircraft fleet in 1942 was arguably superior. Their pilots had more combat experience than many British crews. This is a story about institutional respect. What the Japanese recognized in analyzing Taranto was not just a successful attack. They recognized the signature of deep institutional knowledge, the kind that comes from being first, from making the foundational mistakes, from developing doctrine when no doctrine existed. The British had been building carriers since 1917. They'd been developing carrier doctrine since the 1920s. They'd fought the first carrier versus carrier action in history in 1940. They'd executed the first successful night carrier operation at Taranto. Every innovation, every tactical development, every hard lesson learned, the British had encountered it first, and that created a knowledge differential that couldn't be overcome through superior numbers or newer aircraft. A post-war interrogation of Admiral Shigeru Fukudome, former Chief of Staff of the Combined Fleet, includes this exchange. Interrogator: why did Japanese carrier forces avoid engagement with British carrier groups in 1942, despite numerical superiority? Fukudome: the British had shown at Taranto what carrier forces could accomplish under impossible conditions. We studied this action thoroughly. Our conclusion was that British carrier crews possessed expertise in areas we had not yet developed. The interrogator pressed: what specific areas? Fukudome's response: all of them. This is the hidden cost of innovation. The Americans built more carriers. The Japanese built more lethal aircraft. But the British built the institutional knowledge first. And that knowledge created a psychological advantage that survived even when material advantages disappeared. Japan could copy the techniques demonstrated at Taranto. They could not copy the 20 years of development that made Taranto possible. They could not copy the institutional culture that treated carrier warfare as a science, not an improvisation. And so they did what any rational military force does when facing an opponent with deep institutional knowledge in a critical domain. They avoided them. The statistics are matter of fact. Japanese carriers engaged American carriers in 7 major actions during 1942. Despite American numerical and technological parity or superiority in most cases, Japanese carriers engaged British carriers in 0 major actions during the same period, despite Japanese numerical superiority. This is not coincidence. This is the legacy of Taranto, not in the techniques it demonstrated, but in the respect it commanded. If you found this video valuable, the algorithm needs to know. The like button isn't just for you. It's how we reach others who believe World War II history ended at Normandy. More British military excellence. The history books forgot. Next video reveals why German tank commanders refused to engage a specific British unit. To feature a single encounter in North Africa, the unit's name was never mentioned in German after-action reports, only a number. Subscribe because these stories exist in enemy archives, not Hollywood scripts.